It's a common lamentation that war is too easy for politicians to enter into. And it's considered to be easy because they have the mechanisms to do it, but also they don't face the consequences of it. Long gone are the days where you have a king and everyone else who's important lined up behind him, riding at the front of an army to tackle an enemy head on. We still think in terms of leaders as shorthand, so we think of Trump as going to war against Iran, but Trump couldn't be further from that war. Similarly, Vladimir Putin's not digging trenches in Ukraine, and of course, nor is Volodymyr Zelensky. But as these leaders may face setbacks in achieving the goals that they hope to by using military force, it's inevitable that they turn and reach into their own societies in deeper ways, whether for more money, more equipment, more people, or violations of the rights of those who may not wish to serve by dragging people off the streets and throwing them to the front lines. And you can see this in different forms all over the planet today. I've spoken very strongly against conscription in the past. I think it's one of those ideas that's sort of snuck in and accepted. Even it's thought of as, oh, it's a necessary evil, but I think it's worse than slavery and should be talked about in those terms. I've done a video on my other YouTube channel exploring that, so I don't want to talk about that. But what I have today that I hope is of interest to you is a story that is emerging increasingly across the conflicts that we're seeing in our time, where that disconnect that you have between the leader and the outcomes on a battlefield, where they're divorced from the consequences of the actions that they send others to do, is now being played out not only at the leadership level, but also at the soldier level. And that's been on, I guess, a low curve for some time, because there's a big difference between a bomber pilot from a plane unloading their ordnance over a city and killing tens of thousands of people, and the way that Genghis Khan and his men had to do the same task, chose to do the same task many centuries ago. But that curve is growing even sharper now with the use of AI. And it's occurred to me that this story is sort of largely absent from the day-to-day drama, which is what is very compelling and important otherwise about the wars that are occurring at the moment. But it may end up being a much bigger one and is worth looking at and taking a moment of pause. And so you might not think that this is an interesting topic to you, or you might think that it's a bit confronting and horrible, but I do encourage you to listen on, because I'm not seeing a lot of discourse on this. And I think that it is really important, or I wouldn't be bringing it to you. And it's also an example of how all the sort of end world scenarios that we think of in association with AI maybe capture so much of our attention that we're missing some very big things that are occurring even in the absence of total artificial general intelligence or a total computer world takeover. And indeed, I think that it's fair to say that even if technology didn't advance another step from where it is today, there have been some big disruptions that would take a long time to process, and are things that warrant our concern, awareness, and hopefully the building of better systems so that we can mitigate from the worst of these. I'm going to go through a few examples. But it's important to say that the information that we get on this stuff is pretty low. It's an extremely classified space for obvious reasons. And it's likely that the worst of the stories that I bring to you today are just a fraction of what's occurring. And that the most frightening of the technologies that I refer to today are similarly just a small slice of the capabilities that the most advanced militaries have if they aren't already deployed. So with that cheery intro in mind, I got to say thank you so much for listening and persisting with this. I hope you don't mind me talking about horrible things, but they are things of the world, and I think we owe it to ourselves and reality to understand them and not censor ourselves from them just because they're unpleasant. So sit back, grab a cup of whatever it is that you like. So I hope you're sitting back somewhere comfortable with a cup of whatever it is that you like, because a lot of the words I'm going to say today will be familiar ones in orders that you've already heard and whatever, but I just want to impress upon you that I think that it should remain shocking, because the baseline state of where many things are in the world is shocking. And I really don't want to play any hand in normalizing what is a very extreme state of affairs. You'll know already from the title of the episode that I'm talking about the loss of accountability in the mass systems that we create to kill each other. But you can't just blame me for talking about this. You've also got to blame my beautiful patrons. Thank you so much for being on board. Keep an eye out for a bit of a bonus episode this week as well. And if you want to have access to all of that stuff, head on over to patreon.com/Endrey, Endrey. In the meantime, theme music, and let's get into it. So it's only relatively recently that we've come up with the term genocide to describe the destruction of people. There are thousands, if not tens of thousands, of examples of genocides throughout human history. The most compelling one that sits in our consciousness is, of course, the World War II Holocaust perpetrated primarily against the Jews of Europe. And that sits in our consciousness in a way where we learn, at least how I came across information at school, as a next level kind of horror that was able to be perpetrated because of the abstraction of the tools of the day. And that was what was so shocking about it, to see that normal people who consider themselves, good religious people, they would sit down and read the Bible at night and then wake up and oversee the deaths of another 1,000 people and then kiss their wife and go to bed or whatever. And these things were thought to be incompatible, or that they couldn't coexist with what was at the time the most advanced civilization on the planet. And if you to think about the technologies that enabled that, mechanical power and sort of industrial productivity and large-scale bureaucratic systems, those things as they existed in the 1940s are so rudimentary compared to our human capacities today as to be considered almost barbarian. Our technologies have come so far in terms of data collection, analysis, network decision-making at scale, the raw physical grunt for moving things, the destructive capacity that we have. All those things are so much more advanced now than they were then, which leads to the question, what holocausts might we be falling into committing today? What would they feel like to be experiencing, and what would they feel like to be complicit? And how do we do everything in our utmost to avoid those where they are occurring? Now, it's very clear that there have been total wars on whole groups of people occurring post-World War II and occurring very obviously today. But one missing component of how that occurs, and I think that this is partially because of how we teach history, is that there's a presumption that there has to be some sort of extra special malicious intent or evil aesthetic or totalitarian fascist government or any number of things that we associate with the Third Reich at its sort of stereotypical aesthetic level that we fear being reproduced in our contemporary societies. And I think that that's a big trap. And I'll uncover a bit more of this in the examples I go into today, because just the presence of the tools themselves and the capacities to be distanced from the consequences of our actions, I think may actually just be enough for almost the worst of any human outcomes to be perpetrated. And this is something I think about a lot in all of our consumer stuff. Like, I remember there was a Four Corners report many years ago, which exposed how there were indentured servants working effectively in pressed slavery underneath the decks of freeze fishing ships in Southeast Asia. Basically, what was happening was some ethnic minority groups fleeing, say, Myanmar, might end up in Thailand. Then they'd be indentured into working to these ships. They didn't get a choice of what they were doing, or where they were going to live, or how long they were going to stay, or making any money, or things like that. And they'd be processing the frozen seafood that would end up on your shelf at Coles or Woolworths in Australia. And it's so striking to me, that stuff, because that's just one of any number of examples you can think of in how your distance consumer behavior feeds into something that you at no level would want to be a part of or choose if you had that awareness. But the fact that you don't have the awareness of it is just, oh, look, prawns are $8, I'll get a kilo, and carry on through your day considering yourself a moral person, as much as the leader of the Hitler Youth in a regional city might not see any connection between their behavior and the destruction of the Jews of Europe. And certainly we don't associate this kind of slave owning, southerner on a porch overseeing the plantation aesthetic with just going to the supermarket and buying stuff. But it is, I think you could say, as consequential in many instances of your consumer behavior. And so too now, at a point in the way that AI systems are being developed and implemented on battlefields, where the road from where we are to total destruction is a lot shorter than I think that we may reckon. I said at the beginning that kings don't fight wars, our politicians don't fight wars, but they start them. What do we do in the instance where our soldiers don't fight wars? Because that is increasingly the case. And the technology is moving so quickly and news reporting is so slow and censored in these realms that it is, I think, hard to keep up with the pace of what modern conflicts mean and how they're perpetrated. And again, as I said in the intro, we only get a couple flashpoints of good information, and it's hard to tell exactly what's occurring. But I want to seize onto those that I've come across, because I think they tell a story of a dependency upon artificial intelligence in how we wage war and destroy each other that inadvertently is fueling the normalization of what back in my day we used to consider to be war crimes. And they still are war crimes, but where you have systems-wide diffusion of accountability, who's going to prosecute them, and also who's going to feel bad or who blow the whistle on perpetrating them. And if there is no accountability, and if individuals within the systems committing these crimes don't feel the moral guilt that they otherwise might were they perpetrating these deeds by hand, then as conflicts escalate and widen, the depth to which these things can go, I assert, is much deeper than we may like to think. Anyway, with all that framing underway, I'll start to get into the specific example so you can make your own determinations. Just over 2 years ago, 6 Israeli intelligence officers anonymously spoke to Plus 972 magazine, which is an Israeli-Palestinian publication, and its Hebrew language partner called Local Call, to talk about a system that they had been working with called Lavender AI. And this was an in-house, locally developed military system, which they said was used for targeting in the Gaza war. This tool was used to process vast amounts of data that the Israeli intelligence had on the people of Gaza to identify the likelihood that any given individual is a low-level Hamas operative. And according to these officers, it would have in its database around 37,000 people who were considered to be fairly described as either Hamas or Palestinian Islamic Jihad operatives. Pretty handy tool. But as always with these things, it's what you do with them. And what this tool was used to do was these officers, it was their job, they would get each day presented with a likely target based on all of the surveillance of the whole Gaza Strip. And they'd be presented with somebody and they would have roughly 20 seconds to decide whether or not to give the switch to kill that person. Obviously, how much human intelligence can you offer with 20 seconds of information? And so they said that that period was basically just to determine that the person's name was a male's name and that they were old enough to be plausibly Hamas and to be killed. At which point, a so-called dumb bomb would be launched from a drone in the sky, eliminating what had been deemed to be an enemy unit. This is already, I think, a little bit horrifying to imagine, but it gets worse because in the usage of dumb bombs, and these guys said that you don't want to be wasting high precision munitions on low level targets. And so in each of these instances where a bomb was deployed, there was an inevitable risk of collateral damage, as in innocent civilians also being killed. And when you have large scale systems like this, you don't make individual determinations, which of course are flawed as well, but you have system level evaluations. And for them, their quick shorthand was an acceptable level of collateral damage was to have roughly 15 to 20 civilians in order to get the low ranking Hamas operative. And I like just immediately that doesn't pass any sniff test. Like you couldn't, if you were the police trying to arrest somebody who was a violent criminal, you couldn't reasonably go into a restaurant and shoot up 20 people knowing that you probably got the right person. But this was being perpetrated every 20 seconds for these operatives while they were engaged with the system. What's more, obviously, a big system like this, you don't roll out all at once. They started by testing it, and they concluded that it had a 90% success rate from their early tests, at which point they then said, oh, that's great. Let's elevate the usage and have it as our sweeping IDF targeting system in the Gaza Strip. So that's bad. 1 in 10 of the strikes, they're getting the wrong person, and they may be getting the wrong person and 50 to 20 people acceptable collateral damage. And there's a quote from the article. We were not interested in killing the operatives when they were in a military building. It's much easier to bomb a family's home. The system is built to look for them in these situations, I guess because it's more likely to be effective. Anyway, you can quickly see how this has unfurled to present the complete destruction of that part of the world and the people that live there. And that's not even the fullness of it. I think there are other systems where if they have higher level operatives, the acceptable collateral is 200 people. And so like, these are just the determinations that you have to make if you are going to have large scale systems of industrial killing, which we all have pointed at each other constantly and are currently being used. And it's shocking for onlookers to see the consequences of that. But I think it's really important to connect the reality of those consequences with the systems that produce them. And those systems are not necessarily really nefarious, evil psychopaths doing the worst thing and wanting to kill everybody, but they can just be the mundane things of systems of low accountability for the participants within them. That's not to say that there aren't psychopaths going out there to kill. It's not saying there isn't malicious intent that exists. It's just to say that you really do widen the net of people that are happy to participate in these things by having systems of just totally diffused accountability. And I've linked the full article on the revelations of Lavender AI in the episode description, and I would recommend everybody read it. Because as I said, this stuff shouldn't shouldn't be just casually normalized and we move on with like, oh yeah, I guess we live in an age of horrors. Like I think that it is incumbent upon us to be aware of these things so that we can agitate against them in whatever parts we do have. And so the Lavender AI situation, the eyebrows fell off my head when I read it for the first time. And that was over 2 years ago, just over 2 years ago now. If you think about how shit, Chat GPT image generators were a couple of years ago compared to now, how much more advanced are those systems? They're significantly more advanced. And this was just a small one developed by Israel, which is a small country. And it's worth noting that OpenAI just signed a contract with the Pentagon. The value of it's not known, but there's an increasingly close relationship between the private companies developing the AI that have all the data and have all the latest systems. And of course, the Department of War that is currently at war and doubtless using those systems in its operations. There are two things in that caught my eye in the last couple of weeks. The first one, I already discussed it in a recent episode, was the resignation of Caitlin Kalinowski, who was a senior executive overseeing robotics at OpenAI, who, after they signed the contract with the Pentagon, she resigned concerned about surveillance and autonomous weapons risks, because she said that for her, it was a red line to have robotics to have autonomous kill systems. So what that means in simple language is that Lavender AI system that I described, where the Israeli intelligence officers would be having a quick look and saying, yep, kill them, kill them, kill them, kill them and everyone in their family, kill them and everyone who's around them in the shops or whatever. That's basically removing those guys from that process. This is just the robot in an environment having a look. Yeah, I'll kill them. Yeah, I'll kill them. Yeah, I'll kill them, without any human oversight. That's kind of one of those future hells that we were hoping to avoid from all the science fiction that's on our Earth today. It's hard to know the degree to which that's been rolled out, but which brings me to the second thing that raised my eyebrows, which was last week when the US did their operation outside of Isfahan in Iran to ostensibly just to rescue a pilot, but it seems like there was more going on because they sent a lot of aircraft for that scenario. I'm not commenting on that operation. Just one thing that caught my eye from it was the statement that as part of that operation to extract the US pilot who was stranded in Iran, MQ-9 Reaper drones controlled the area by striking Iranian military-aged males believed to be a threat who got to within 3 kilometers of the airmen that they were trying to rescue. And that has seemingly been a small detail of the story and the reporting because it's a Hollywood thing to bust out a pilot, and there are bigger horrors occurring at the moment for people to be concerned about. But you can't reasonably rule out that these drones, because they're operating in areas of jamming and all that, and all sorts of other stuff. So it's not likely they're being controlled by an operator in Virginia. They're autonomous to some degree. It's quite possible that they're just scanning the faces of people on the ground, determining their gender, determining their age, and blowing them up for being within 3 kilometers of a target that they may not have even known was there. And that is pretty fucking horrible. That's pretty horrible. If that is the case, I hope that there are whistleblowers that are concerned from within these organizations, but quite possibly no one will say anything. It's very often that you find out certain massacres that occur or other horrible crimes. Nobody really talks about them and they only come out years later. So the ones that we do hear about, they often require extraordinary individuals to surface the information. But yes, I'm just going to say that again. Can you imagine if just everywhere within a 3 kilometer radius of an individual, anyone who a machine identifies as being a military aged male can just be legitimately killed from the sky? It's horrifying. And it's not even the worst thing that's happened that's potentially associated with this. As I said, the information that we get, we only get a fraction of the things that are actually occurring. And we don't get the full story of how things happen. But another story that we do have, of course, is that school that was struck in the first day of the war, where the Americans fired upon and destroyed 170 plus people, mostly schoolgirls, at a girls' school. And it's not impossible that that could have been an AI-generated target, because the site of the school used to be a military base and it was next to a current military base. So it's perfectly plausible that there could just be some incorrect database that has identified that as a military base, feed that into the AI system. Yep, let's go, hit the button, strike all the complex targets, strike all the people most likely to be members of the Revolutionary Guard, et cetera, et cetera. The drones, the planes go out, fire their bombs, and whoopsie daisies, we've immediately struck a girls' school. this type of crime and this type of horror really needs to have a line of accountability drawn to it. And if it's the case that the people who are operatives within it didn't know what the systems were that they were using or didn't know the consequences, then it has to go all the way up to the level of the decision making of the person who's responsible for the overall systems, who in this case is, of course, the President of America and the Secretary of the Department of War. And good luck finding any mechanisms to hold those two accountable, even if they were signatory to the very weak international institutions that we have, which they aren't. There's no automatic guarantee that the International Criminal Court would even prosecute for something like this, which I guess leads me to the two main points that I wanted to make to close this episode. And thanks so much for persisting and listening. I think these are really important stories to share. The first one is that so much of our conversation about the future of artificial general intelligence and the machine world taking over is so fixated upon, understandably, upon the end point of the worst case scenarios of that stuff, where we're sort of all slaves to the robots and living in the matrix, etc. That I think we're missing the very important story that where we are now is already a horrible situation, and that sometimes the worst stuff that exists is just the boring nature that humans use technology, and all new tools are good or bad, and they're going to be used for all the things that humans do anyway. And knowing that one of those things is kill each other, big new powerful tools to do that is kind of inevitably going to lead to this stuff. And that's already a big story of the dangers and risks of having artificial intelligence as a new technology that we wield. And the second point, that is one that I'm always happy to create a forum to make, is that we fixate upon specific semantic descriptions and feel-good buzzwords about rights and crimes and laws and criminals. They often serve as a interfering layer of abstraction from the ultimate truth, which is it actually doesn't really matter if something is a war crime. Is it a war crime to kill someone on a bridge? For sure. If it's a civilian bridge, we shouldn't blow it up. But it's also, as a person, I'm no less upset to be exploded in what's in something that's considered to be a legitimate military target, like an airport or something like that. So the point I'm trying to make is that it is war itself that is the crime. And there should be far more safety notches between all of our human systems and the capacity to pull the lever to go to war. Increasingly, making sure that that's the case universally must be the main human endeavor that we pursue for security. Because as these systems continue to expand and the already known consequences of escalation within wars find themselves fewer steps away with systems that involve more computational power than human accountability, the chances of the worst stuff happening for all of us only go up. And of course, it's no win to only have thousands of people killed in the latest war, only 100,000 people killed in the latest ethnic cleansing, or whatever it may be. A tragedy for even just one is a terrible tragedy if it was preventable. And I hope that going forward, we can do a better job at safeguarding not just the future from a general AI takeover and those scenarios, but just the very boring existing systems of human accountability. I think there are great lessons to be taken from the way that the US and Israel have waged their war against Iran and Lebanon and Gaza. And those lessons need to be taken by all of us so that we can at least extract some value from the horrors that have been contained therein. In the meantime, I hope that you personally are doing all right, and that the fledgling risks of peace breaking out can expand, and that we can focus on what matters, which is, hopefully me talking about my little opinions instead of deconstructing horrors that seem to be largely unmentioned. If you like this episode, please do send it to a friend. If you didn't like it, please don't tell anybody about it, and even forget yourself, so that you can come back again and listen next week to another episode of the Chris Endrey Podcast. Thank you so much, and thanks to my patrons, and thank you for following me over at Instagram at Chris Endrey Podcast. I'd love to have you guys around, and I'll speak to you again soon.